I'm Scott Sagan, the co-director here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and it's a great pleasure to invite both the online audience and people in the room to Ori Rabinowitz's seminar today on the role of Israel's counter-proliferation policy in U.S.-Israeli negotiations. Ori is an associate professor at Hebrew University, but we've had the great good fortune of having her here for a year now, both teaching a very popular undergraduate class and conducting research here at CISAC and being, I think, a really superb corporate citizen of the group in terms of her mentoring and advice to others. She is the author of Bargaining on Nuclear Tests, a really fascinating study of U.S. efforts to try to deter testing from states that they believed had nuclear weapons to stop the development of further nuclear capabilities. And she's been researching on the topic that she'll be talking about today. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for coming, and thank you, Scott, for the warm words. Just before we start the actual seminar, I wanted to say thank you personally to Scott and to other colleagues in CISAC for making a very, very difficult term hospitable, and these are very difficult times for Israelis in general and Israeli scholars abroad and in the US. And I'm lucky enough that I was enveloped with compassion and solidarity here at CISAC, and I don't think I could have been any luckier. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. Whatever we're going to talk about today has deep roots and deep ties to the ongoing war, the Israel-Gaza war and Israel-US relations. So please feel free to ask me questions and talk to me about it. We're not trying to shy away from this issue, au contraire. So my project, which has been ongoing for a couple of years, looks at the role of Israel's counter-proliferation policy in the wider context of US-Israeli nuclear relations, or relations in general, if you wish. And here's how I launched the program. I've been working a lot in both realms, basically. And I noticed that there's quite a big variation, a huge difference between how the Osirak raid, the 1981 Israeli decision and operation to attack the Iraqi reactor in June 81, was received and was treated and conditioned before and after during the terms of Presidents Carter and Reagan, and how the Israeli raid against the Syrian reactor, which unfolded in 2007, was accepted and treated. And here we have, in the case of, the laser point will not be working, so you have to trust me. In the case of Carter and Reagan, we actually have quite a lot of documents, both from Israel, from the US, from the British archives and other sources. And in the 2007 case, we don't have the archival documents, but we have quite a lot of sources. And what I noticed was that, first of all, the treatment of the raid themselves were quite different. But also the context of the US-Israeli nuclear relations were quite different. And I wanted to see how the two fields interact and what role do they play with each other or within each other. But more specifically, and I'll walk you through this as we go along, if in 1980, 1981, if you want 1979, legitimacy of Israel's nuclear program was relatively limited, and it was a closely held secret confined to the president and some of his top aides. When we reach the 2007-2008 period, we see a very dramatic break. Not only did President Bush allow for or unfurl a full diplomatic umbrella over the raid, in 2008, he's already asked by Prime Minister Olmert to actually take the nuclear understanding, the US-Israel nuclear understanding, brief Obama, initiate him into this, and this is done completely on the record, published in the Israeli press, in press pieces, and you can see here one of the reports on it. They get the full brief, and it gets the Israeli military censor's approval. The last thing you can label this is a secret, basically. So obviously, we've traversed quite a long road in both areas. When I delved deeper into the literature and the available explanations, I found that to all effects and purposes, we're dealing with two quite separate bodies of literature or corpora of literature. On the one hand, we have important works detailing Israel's nuclear history and the evolution of its strategy. So two important works here are by Avner Cohen and Shai Feldman, Israeli-American scholars. Specifically, Shai Feldman wrote about the 90s, which is a period we'll look more into, but he wrote it from a contemporary point of view. The book came out in 96 and uses mainly newspapers, and we're going to delve a bit deeper. And we have a body of literature which treats Israel's counter-proliferation records, but it basically and mostly looks at the tactical operational history. We have journalists and scholars who write about how the raids took place. One excellent account is by reporter Yaakov Katz. It's called The Shadow Strike, about the 2007 strikes. There are others. Ronen Bergman, an Israeli journalist who also publishes in the New York Times, published a famous book called Rise and Kill First, which details the history of the Mossad's targeted killing operations, and they focus a lot about how counter-proliferation measures incorporated targeted killing, but we don't have this one overarching story. I wanted to know what role did Israel's counter-proliferation policy historically play within US-Israeli nuclear relations. I use a periodical framework. My work is mostly, so I have there's a debate whether it's a pure history or poli-sci IR in history. I think it's a bit of both or a bit of everything, and this is how I basically organize my research. I have one section of what I hope would be a book detailing what happened in the period between the 1960s and 1991. There's another section, a chapter, detailing the very dramatic break which took place during the Gulf War and after it, in the lead up to the Madrid conference, which took place in October and November 91. And one or two chapters, probably two chapters, a section discussing 92 onwards. And here I should also tell you that this is where the archival documents end. We have archival documents going up to roughly 92, 93. And the mini cases and the examples we discuss after that are based on other sources, not on archival documents. And one of the main arguments I'm trying to push, or the main argument, and I'll show you in a moment what we're talking about, is that we have this arc where after the Gulf War in the first couple of years of the 1990s, there's an Israeli interest to foster growing legitimacy of Israel's counter-proliferation. The Israelis are starting to understand that they may be facing a future with multiple nuclear actors in the Middle East, and strategically speaking, this is something that the Israeli leadership is starting to consider. And the idea or the logic of how to foster future legitimacy of Israeli counter-proliferation operations is also linked to the legitimacy or to the attempt to expand the legitimacy of the Israeli nuclear capabilities and the nuclear status itself. I'm going to start with reviewing the first chapter of the book. Not chapter, excuse me, section. I think it would probably end up being two chapters. And this is based on some of my previous work. It's a relatively long period of time from the 1960s to the lead up of the Gulf War. And what we see here is, first of all, a relatively limited acceptance of the Israeli nuclear status from the 1961 Nixon-Meir deal going forward. And you'll see in a minute why I think it was relatively limited. We also see examples of pushback on counter-proliferation. Israeli attempts to get the US and other actors to work to prevent further nuclear proliferation in the Middle East are actually countered by the fact that Israel has its own nuclear weapons. And we see this being played out in the area of civilian nuclear experts as well. And Israel is basically not getting any, and you'll see it in a moment, some examples. One important theme in this section is the fact that Israel's counter-proliferation operations did not start with the Begin Doctrine. This is kind of a misconception. The Begin Doctrine is the moniker we use to describe Menachem Begin, Israeli Prime Minister's decision to launch a raid against the Iraqi reactor in '81. And in many reports, you'll see that this was the first or the day one of Israel's counter-proliferation operations. Historically, this is actually not the case. I'll show you that historically speaking, these attempts start actually in 1962. They first target the Egyptian missile program, which is considered to be a nuclear missile program, as you'll see in a minute. And we see that, in fact, the Israeli counter-proliferation operations are wider in breadth and scope than maybe mostly assumed. They target both civilian and military programs. They use a variety of targets. So we're not only talking about bombing reactors like in '91 and 2007, we're talking about figuring out, if we're talking about Stuxnet, right, how to mess around with Iranian centrifuges. That's one example, but we have many other examples and also deploying a variety of actors. We have efforts led by diplomats trying to talk exporters to not export nuclear exports to the region. We see politicians, you'll see in a minute, Israeli Prime Minister Rabin talking to President Nixon, and there are other examples, massive use of covert operations by Mossad, and really the entire span of the spectrum. If you want to place it on a diplomacy versus aggression spectrum, then you can really cover all your bases here. Let's start with the Egyptian missile program. We have now new Israeli sources, which have been declassified. One of them is a 1982 military intelligence report detailing what the military intelligence was up to in respect to the Egyptian missile program in the 1960s. And we now have a relatively good grasp of the fact that Israel was actually concerned that the Egyptian missile program had a nuclear potential. So for those of you who do not know, the uninitiated, in July 1962, Israel is surprised by the Egyptian successful execution of missile launches. The Egyptians launch a few missiles, and this causes a lot of havoc in Israel, and the Israeli Mossad starts a targeting operation targeting the Egyptian missile program. What I want to stress here is that the fear was very much nuclear related. They had a source recruited within the program, an Austrian chemist called Otto Joklik, and he basically told them, yeah, we were discussing with the Egyptians two potential nuclear-related projects. One of them was called Project Cleopatra. They're looking into maybe putting together 6 nuclear bombs using AGU. He's also pitching to them another project to basically develop radioactive shells. The project isn't mature at all, but the Israelis are concerned with its potential, because one of the things that Otto Joklik proposed was to introduce the Egyptians to a famous centrifuge scientist called Gernot Zippe. Some of you have heard of him. He's actually quite famous. And in the late 1960s, the Zippe enrichment centrifuges are going to actually prove themselves quite efficient. So from the Israeli point of view, the question of whether or not the Egyptians would actually manage to get on board with someone like Zippe or someone similar is actually quite serious. And the 1962 annual intelligence report says the current plans, the Egyptians' plans, are not practical, but the fact that they're thinking about it should really bother us. And just to expand a little more about it, they also outlined in 1963 how the Egyptians could, in theory, progress. And they say, listen, if they manage to purchase 20% AGU abroad, and this is the 1960s, we don't have regulation on uranium exports in the early 1960s. And if they manage to recruit some experts, then yeah, basically they could reach technological achievements, dramatic technological achievements in a couple of years. Now, this doesn't happen. They don't recruit the high-ranking centrifuge scientists, but this is the concern, and this motivates the efforts to a large degree. Another interesting development which takes place in the Egyptian context is a reported raid by Israeli pilots during the first day of the Six-Day War. They raid a base, an Egyptian base called Inshas, and some pilots also say that they've hit a small nuclear reactor, research reactor that was built there. These reports are not confirmed. So we have the pilots saying that, but we don't have protocols by the IDF, by the Air Force saying, yes, we know that this target was actually hit or not. I should mention that even if it was hit, it was really, really mildly impacted. We're talking about what the pilots called spontaneous runs. This isn't a targeted operation trying to take out a reactor, but I still think it's important for the discussion to understand that if this actually happened in the Osirak raid and the Iranian Air Force's raid against the reactor in September 1980 were also not the first raids against the reactor in the Middle East. But again, I should stress that the reports are unconfirmed. Let's go to the mid-1970s. Israel tries to diplomatically sabotage or curtail Egyptian efforts to purchase civilian nuclear reactor from the US. And we have a protocol from the Israeli archive basically outlining the logic or the thrust of where we're at, where Rabin tells Nixon that there's a real danger that the reactors could lead to what he called dangerous weapons meant for Israel. But we see a very strong pushback by Nixon. He says, well, Israel will be doing all right too. We know how well off you are in this respect. Let's not kid each other. The fact that Israel has nuclear weapons arsenal or capabilities is something that's basically being used to countermand the Israeli demands to work there. And then a similar thing happens in the late 1970s when Israel is now preoccupied with what it calls the French initiative, the French export of nuclear technology to both Pakistan and Iraq. And similar to the Egyptian file, we also see the Mossad doing what they term as hard thwarting and soft thwarting, so trying to sabotage the exports, trying to make sure that, or trying to convince foreigners, French and Italians, not to work and not to lend a hand to these programs. And one of the interesting documents, and there are several, which kind of echo what Nixon told Rabin, is a protocol of a meeting between Israeli ambassador Meir Rosen to France, I should say, and Jacques Valls, the Secretary of the Élysée Palace. Basically, the Israelis want to make sure that the French would maybe stop exporting nuclear technology and the components of the reactor to Iraq, and stop exporting specifically plutonium-sensitive technology to Pakistan. And Jacques Valls tells him, well, once an atomic bomb is developed by Pakistan, Israel's situation would be less convenient, but I would like to hope that you have at least 10 bombs already. So you see this pushback, the fact that Israel has its own capabilities basically undermines any attempt by Israel to get other actors to collaborate with. When we try to frame Israeli-American nuclear relations during the Carter administration, we'd see that Carter is relatively hostile to Dimona. We have some unconfirmed reports of him basically telling Begin in the last day of the Camp David talks, listen, if you don't take out the settlements for Sinai, you won't have Dimona either. And there are some other unconfirmed reports on Carter's relatively hostile or not very happy about Dimona, let's say, approach. That being said, he did maintain the Israel-US understanding at the time. But when the US passed the 1978 nuclear non-proliferation legislation, it basically required a presidential waiver to export nuclear reactors to Israel. And this is where Carter drew the line. He wasn't willing to grant Israel such waiver. And despite the fact that contracts were signed in August 1976, during the Carter administration, this didn't move forward. When we look at how a possible Israeli raid against the Osirak reactor shaped up, you see that by really the last weeks of the Carter administration in office, there is acknowledgement that we're not talking about Israeli alarmism. We have a document assessing that the likelihood of the Iraqis withdrawing from the NPT and using their nuclear fuel to make bombs is actually not impossible. They call it relatively low, but they acknowledge that it exists. And they say, well, you know, Iraq would indeed acquire working knowledge of nuclear fuel cycle capabilities in the next following years, and they could use their nuclear fuel to basically produce, and I'm quoting, at most 1 to 3 devices. So they acknowledge the fact that Iraq may actually be putting together these 3 nuclear bombs, but they actually don't see this as a justification for an Israeli raid. And Peter Tarnoff, who just passed away this month, or in early November, was the executive who wrote the document, who says, well, you know, Iraqi acquisition of a nuclear explosive capability would pose an extraordinarily serious risk to Israel, but the strike, an Israeli strike, would be grave and it would have unwanted implications, and direct action by Israel is not justified and it would risk stability in the Middle East. So really not a fan of a possible strike. I'm not going to go too much into the Reagan administration's reaction, but what I want to stress is 2 things, is that while Reagan himself was probably supportive of the Israel, and we have no reports that he thought twice about renewing the Israel-US nuclear understanding, we can't say the same about the entire administration. And for example, you'll see that when the Pentagon was debating how to react to the Osirak raid, and this was leaked to Israelis in an Israeli cable, you see that some of the measures that the Pentagon officials were discussing was actually targeting Israel's nuclear status. So for example, they proposed demanding that Israel would accept international oversight of Dimona and join the NPT. And later on, the US and this is, I think, something important, on June 19, 1981, the US accepts and participates in UN Council Resolution 487, which explicitly calls on Israel to join the NPT and accept safeguards on Dimona. So again, you see some pushback between Israeli counter-proliferation operations and what happens in the nuclear sphere in general. I'm going to talk a little bit about 91. I see that I don't have a whole lot of time, so I'll try to be relatively concise. Here we have a dramatic break in 91. And this dramatic break has been understudied in the literature, because what happens, and you'll see in a second how, is that if until 91, the Israeli-US nuclear understandings were kept as a stringent secret, in November 91, they're just covering they're blown apart in the Israeli press, and it's important to understand why. Just as a framing mechanism, I'd like you to keep in mind that we have two different analytically separate secrets which basically converge in 91. On the one hand, Israel has been quite open with the fact that it has Dimona and it has a nuclear infrastructure, and you see quotes in a second from the 1960s onward. On the other hand, the deal itself, the 1961 Nixon-Meir deal, the deal where President Nixon and Prime Minister Golda Meir reached an understanding where we think what the understanding basically said that Israel would not test or declare or threaten its neighbors, and the US would remove it from the bilateral agenda. This understanding was completely kept in complete secrecy until 91. And what's important is how the secrets converged. These are some quotes to basically substantiate the fact that Dimona was an open secret. For example, from 1967, Israel will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the region, but it's capable of producing nuclear weapons in 18 months. This is basically how we define the nuclear threshold. And again, this is just one example of a quote. The second quote is by Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, from 68. Israel has the people with the technological know-how, but it's focused on civilian research. And I can give you a list of probably 100 quotes similar to that. In the 70s, we see a reorientation of how the Israeli leadership publicly talks about this. So this is just one example, and I think it's a very good example of having your foot in your mouth. It's not very clear what Rabin, as a prime minister, wants here, and he says, Israel is not a nuclear state in the military sense of the word. We cannot afford to be the second state to introduce nuclear weapons to the region, but we cannot be the first either. If someone can, glean a policy from that, then email me, please. But this is just an example. What happens in May 91 and following the Gulf War is a complete overhaul of the things that we're going to discuss. Basically, Israel has shown restraint during the Gulf War and agreed to basically accepted US demands that it's not going to attack and retaliate against the launch of 39 Iraqi Scads against Israel during the Gulf War. But the Israeli Prime Minister Shamir is disappointed to find out that this restraint is actually not rewarded politically. And after the war, once the war is over, we see a great push on two different aspects. And these have been actually written about in the literature. One, we have the political push to put together a peace process. This would lead to the Madrid conference, and later on, this would we would have the agreements between the Israel and Palestinian Authority. There's the peace agreement with Jordan. It's quite studied in the literature. What hasn't been studied is what happened in the nuclear front. And here we have this understudied initiative from May 91, where President Bush gives a speech and he calls for a new initiative which would curb both conventional weapons, WMD weapons in the Middle East, and missile proliferation. And he also, and this is interesting, proposes the end of production of fissile material, or what we call the FMCT, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. Now we have new documents from all sorts of archives which basically tell us that Bush was actually trying to target the Israeli nuclear program with the FMCT, and we have it on record with very interesting quotes by different officials, especially in discussions between the Americans and the British. We also have memos, National Security Council memos from April 91 and documents from the British Archive basically telling us how the British and the Americans saw this. It's important to understand that following the Gulf War, there was renewed interest to curb nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. There's a United Nations Security Council resolution from April that you're basically targeting Iraq, targeting the Iraqi nuclear program, but also calling on the establishment of a nuclear-free zone, a WMD zone in the Middle East. And from the Israeli perspective, this means that Bush is potentially coming after Dimona. If they're now interested in clearing out the Middle East of nuclear weapons, and we have one country with nuclear weapons, then this may be a problem. What happens, and I'm gonna keep my notes relatively short. In September 91, Israeli-American relations take a nosedive. Again, this has to do with the political aspect. The Shamir government was asking for loan guarantees to assimilate Jewish immigrants from the Soviet Union. There was a huge kerfuffle with the Bush administration, and Bush famously had this comment, made this comment in a speech he was giving in Congress, the same day that AIPAC had a big seminar there. And this blew up the relationship, and there was a lot of acrimonious language. You can Google it, and you see some nasty words being reportedly being said by both Bush and Shamir. Sorry, Bush and Baker, describing Shamir. I'm not going to repeat them here. But from the Israeli perspective, there's a lot of concern that the gloves are now off and Bush is coming after Dimona. Sorry, I'll get to this in a second. One of the troubling things that happen from the Israeli perspective is the fact that the Americans are now collaborating with the Egyptians in the IAEA's General Conference meeting of September 91. They're voting together for a resolution which calls to open all nuclear facilities for inspections in the Middle East. This is quite worrisome for Israel. And we see an onslaught of Israeli reports. And again, what's important to understand here is that because these reports were published in Israeli media, they were all published with the approval of the Israeli military censor. So officials that are quoted here, they know exactly well that they're going to be quoted. And you'll see in a second that these quotes basically reflect a grave Israeli fear that Bush, and I'm quoting, is coming after Dimona. One headline reads, "Concerning Jerusalem, Bush decided to limit Israel's nuclear freedom." A second reads, "Shamir considers adopting a new nuclear policy," and it's linked to the fear of the Bush administration coming after Dimona. A third article says, "There's no change in the Israeli policy on the nuclear issue for now, but we already have butterflies, parparim bebeten, butterflies in our stomach." And this all happens just in the days leading to the Madrid conference, the famous regional multinational peace conference, which would take place in late October, early November, which would also have a nuclear WMD component in it. And here's what happens immediately after the Madrid conference. Someone in the Israeli leadership decides that it's time to push back. It's seen as, if we can categorize it, I think that the leadership saw the Bush push as potentially trying to delegitimize Dimona and Israel's capabilities. And here they just go to the newspaper and they detail the entire understanding. And they actually go on the record. The newspaper itself says, the report says, the Israelis are concerned that the Americans will withdraw from the understanding, the Nixon-Meir deal, which is detailed in the item. I should mention that it was published by journalist Aluf Ben in Haaretz in November 91. Jerusalem fears that the administration will withdraw from it and re-examine its policy on this delicate matter. And this is, I think, something that has been understudied, and we need to understand that this fear of an American administration deciding to turn on the existing understanding and possibly turn on the pressure on Israel is something that was deeply impactful during the 90s, and is something that I think is still relevant today. I'll just give you a brief overview in the few minutes we have left of the following section. Again, we have only some limited documents from the early 90s, and we work with biographies and newspapers and just common sense afterwards. But there are a few things that are important to understand. It has been reported in the literature, especially by Shai Feldman, that Israel in the 90s conducted a policy reorientation. It decided to join many US-led arms control initiatives, basically anything that is short of Israel joining the NPT. So for example, Israel joined the CTBT. For example, Israel joined the CWC. There's an effort, an Israeli effort to reorient the policy. We also know that President Clinton basically, when the 1995 NPT review conference came around, decided not to push Israel because the peace process was still ongoing. And it's actually been also reported in the press, because a third thing that happened is we have terrifically increased nuclear transparency. The Israeli press from 93 to 95 reports everything, almost everything nuclear. They will tell you Rabin and Peres are now discussing a reorientation of the policy, and they're, Peres thinks that they should join the NPT 2 years after after the long corridor approach happens, and Israel establishes peace with its neighbors and the entire Middle East. And the press details everything. And Avner Cohen in his work has also written extensively about how in the 90s we see this increased transparency. But this is what we didn't see. And I think this is what's important for us. The reorientation of the policy also had a strong logic or a strong motivation to consider counter-proliferation activities in the future, because Israel in the early 1990s is already trying to think about what would happen if a nuclear rival would emerge in the Middle East. They know that they're now discovering that Iraq was actually quite developed in its nuclear pursuit, right? So when The inspectors go into Iraq. After the Gulf War, they discovered that the Iraqi program was actually quite mature. There's initial rising concern with the Iranian nuclear program at this time, and we see some strategic thinking. And one of the documents that was declassified in the Israeli archive connects this thinking of tying counter-proliferation to this reoriented policy. And here's just this one quote out of many interesting quotes. So the document basically proposes that Israel would pursue a new or reinvigorated or reoriented nuclear understanding with the US. And the document states, as the basis of this strategic cooperation with the US, we can imagine that we would find an understanding according to which Israel will support US efforts to promote WMD and arms control issues globally and regionally, and maybe we'll even agree to accept some of the commitments in the Bush plan. This has not been accepted. Israel didn't join the FNCP. I assume most of us know this. And in response, the hope is that the US will acknowledge Israel's unique need to possess a strategic deterrent capability, given the threat that it's going to face. And here's maybe one of the important points that the document makes. Such an understanding, my commentary, a renewed or reoriented understanding, may promote countering efforts on the one hand and prevent pressure on Israel in areas that are not convenient for her. The idea here is that if you want to make sure that in the future you'll have legitimacy to work in counter-proliferation area, and I'm adding, and not receive the comments similar to the one that Nixon and the French made in the 1970s, then maybe you want to work on strengthening US-Israeli relations. One of the things that they do is also they promote pursuing a political solution to the Israeli-Arab conflict with the Syrian track and the Palestinian track. And the idea is that this would impact the legitimacy that Israeli counter-proliferation operations would enjoy in the future. It's important to understand, and I'll talk about this quote in a second, we're not talking about a formal understanding granting Israel freedom to do whatever it wants. But just before I tie all the loose ends together, I want to show you how in the 90s going forward, we do see a reoriented understanding between the US and Israel. And one of the best examples is the fact that the secret deal, which was kept secret until 91 and kind of blown apart in November 91, is now becoming more central in the reports. So for example, and in how the leadership refers to them, Prime Minister Rabin, when he spoke about it, this is in a joint press conference with the King Hussein of Jordan and Clinton in the summer of 94, he already ties the previously untied, the previously separated, analytically distinct nuclear secrets. And he says, we've been committed to the US for years not to be the first to introduce. So this isn't just an introduction. This isn't repeating Israel's famous formula of non-introduction. He's now saying, well, the commitment was for the US. We committed to this not to be the first. And this is a part of this synergized deal or understanding. We have no indication of a formal understanding on counter-proliferation, but we do see the legitimacy of Israeli counter-proliferation bolstered or expanded, and it's nothing like we saw in the 1970s. And just as an example of the bolstered legitimacy to the nuclear program, not to the counter-proliferation aspect of it, but to the nuclear program, we know that throughout the 90s onwards, the legitimacy that Israel's nuclear capabilities or the understanding received grew exponentially. And for example, and this was reported in the press in March 2000, President Clinton gave a letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu in 98 and later on to Prime Minister Barak in 2000, reiterating that Israel's nuclear capabilities would effectively remain intact and would be, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's not what the report says, but I'm explaining it to you, basically would be safe from a renewed Bush initiative, because the fear of a US president that would be hostile to Israel and decide to erode the legitimacy of the understanding is basically still around. So this is just, reported widely. And in the Israeli point of view, the fact that there's a letter which really puts it to stone is something that they value very much. And I'll give you two quotes from, they were taken under Chatham House rules, so I can't tell you who said them, but this is how it's described. The letter, what was previously implicit is now explicit. It's a formal commitment. It's in writing. We have it etched in stone. It's reiterated time and again by multiple administrations. It's a pillar of understanding. It's a formal seal of approval. In the Israeli perspective, this is something that's quite meaningful and pushes the legitimacy to its end. I'm going to conclude now. I think 40 minutes is kind of where we were aiming at, so I'll just finish with a few points. So our the starting point of our discussion was the role of Israel's counter-proliferation policy in the wider context of US-Israel nuclear relations. And historically, I think we can see that we have a double or a dual historical arc. On the one hand, we have a growing legitimacy to the nuclear capability or the nuclear understanding, and on the other hand, we have a growing a reevaluated legitimacy post-91 of Israeli counter-proliferation efforts, and specifically I'm thinking about the 2007 raid against the Syrian reactor and reports of joint Israeli-American collaboration targeting the Iranian nuclear program, Stuxnet, and other operations that we saw forward. But, and I think this is the important takeaway, legitimacy is not formal, legitimacy may erode. Specifically in the US-Israel case, it has a lot to do with the relationship between the president and the prime minister, and I think what we saw with Biden and Netanyahu, can go into it, is an example of that. And there's a fear, because this is an informal phenomena, general delegitimization of Israel, for example, following events and wars like we now see between Israel and Gaza, may erode support for both spheres. Because the legitimization, sorry, it's a difficult word, is actually not set in stone and not that enshrined like we saw in the quotes I just show you. And I think that from the Israeli perspective, the fear of a new Bush plan or a president that would decide that nuclear proliferation in the Middle East merits an attempt to maybe get the Israeli nuclear program to cut it back or to limit it or to somehow place inhibition on it is one thing, but it may also impact the legitimization that Israel's counter-proliferation policies enjoy, and they may also affect each other. And just as a final note, if you remember, up until the war, Biden basically refused to host Netanyahu in the White House. They did agree to kind of do a very short meet and greet at the outskirts of the UN in September, the UN meeting in September in New York. But just to exemplify and stress how important this is, we know that the renewed commitment to the Nixon-Murray deal takes place when the president meets the prime minister privately in the White House. This isn't something that happened in the September meeting. So for all effects and purposes, formally, from what we can assess, the understanding wasn't formally extended, because we know that in previous meetings, since Clinton, since March 93 onwards, whenever an Israeli prime minister and a US president meet, the press then later also reports, and they've renewed the understanding, the strategic understanding, etc. So there is a lot of, it's very important to understand the relationship between the Israeli and the American leader on a personal level, but it's also very important to understand the legitimization in the international context. So I'll stop here, and thank you.
Thank you. We're going to follow the CISAC norm on the research seminars of having fellows ask the first few questions, but I also would like the people online to type their questions into the Q&A, so we can go back and forth between the in-person audience and the online audience. So who wants to ask the first question or make the first comment? No, you're not a fellow. Lindsay, you can go. No, he is.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this was just really informative for me. I was wondering, beyond the context of Israeli-US relations, do you also look at, changing legitimacy of the non-aligned movement too, and how that, okay, yeah.
But I am planning to add an American chapter, a comparative chapter discussing American non-proliferation activities, counter-proliferation activities, but I'm not there yet.
Well, your first book does look at at US efforts with other countries to discourage testing. But are there other examples of the United States with other countries dealing with their more active non-proliferation policy, their counter-proliferation policy? South Korea would be an example.
I think that,
purposes.
so shall I answer now?
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of examples we can take from the US, and the question is, where do we draw the line exactly when we talk about counter-proliferation on the one hand and non-proliferation on the other? I think that there is an overlap. I don't think that we can completely conceptually separate them. For example, in 2003, the US and the British reached a deal with Libya on Libya's nuclear disarmament. That's a terrific example of something that's counter-proliferation and non-proliferation, and uses diplomatic measures to disarm a country, and that's diplomatically without a shot being fired. We also have some reports that the US during the Carter administration was may have been discussing a raid against the Pakistani nuclear program, but they decided against it. And the same thing, we can say the same about Kennedy era discussions between the Americans and the Taiwanese about possibly launching a commando raid targeting the Chinese nuclear program. And my colleague Rachel Ritlark also wrote about it, if you remember, and she talked about it this last year here. So there are examples where the US considered it, but we don't see examples of the US adopting a similar policy to what Israel has done. We do know that, for example, during the Gulf War, the US did include nuclear targets in the target bank, but this was during an ongoing war, and they were a part of a wider bank of targets. It wasn't a counter-proliferation operation targeting Iraqi nuclear facilities, specifically separate from ongoing hostilities. But what I can say is that from the 91 Gulf War onwards, and especially during the 90s, there's increased US interest to look at what's going on in the Middle East, and the Americans want to make sure that the Iraqi nuclear program doesn't reemerge. So it's definitely a watershed moment.
Good.
Very wonderful presentation. Thank you, Claude Lambert, U.S. Army visiting scholar here at CISAC. I'm wondering about the Vela incident and what it was its impact on the future legitimacy of Israeli counter-proliferation policy. What impacts did that have?
Summarize the Vela incident first for those people who may not be fully aware of recent research on it, and then go to Claude's question.
So Vela is the name of a series of American satellites, and Vela incidents refers to a specific incident which took place on the night between 20 and 21 September 1979, where one of these Vela satellites picked up something that we call a double hump. So the phenomena was registered like this, a double hump of a camel, if you will. And a debate has been raging on, and I think it's kind of, the shoe kind of fell on one side, on whether or not this was an Israeli-South African nuclear test. And initially, and to cut a long story short, the American understanding, or the official stand, was that it was not a nuclear test, but what they called, the relevant report called a zoo event. Basically a beam of light bouncing on the water twice and creating the double hump. But today, based on new sources and new evidence, the scholarly community basically agrees that this was in high likelihood a low-yield nuclear test. And the question is, who conducted it? There are two prime suspects, but no smoking gun in terms of determining who exactly, if you will, pulled the trigger. Specifically, this was picked up in the Indian Ocean, halfway between South Africa and the polar. So imagine halfway in between. So this either could have been a South African test, an Israeli test, or some sort of a collaboration. We don't know. We don't have the documents. South African sources haven't been speaking openly on it. But I haven't seen in the literature anything that can tell me that this caused a dramatic change of policy in the American side. I think it was basically brushed aside. And I can add that in December 1980, another signal was picked up and completely ignored.
Could I ask a follow-on, which is there any discussion in the literature of why Israel would be as confident as it appears to be about its nuclear capability if it has not conducted such tests?
So I'm not aware of a specific discussion in the literature, but my understanding is that the assumption is that if you have scientists that are well trained and have access to the relevant technology, and perhaps some sources indicate or believe that maybe Israel had access to French data of nuclear testing in the early 60s. We don't know it. It's it's an assumption, for example, or advanced computing capabilities, then perhaps the state would need to test, but we don't have, because the Israeli nuclear program itself is not transparent, we don't know exactly what leads them to make that, to reach that conclusion.
It's an interesting question because sometimes, for example, on missiles, the US will look at the North Koreans and say, oh, they have wildly overestimated their capabilities because they haven't had testing, because we have done so much testing, and we'll say that about their nuclear capabilities, but we don't say that about Israel in the same way. And I think this question about reliability is an interesting one. And
I agree with you. I think that maybe a key point to take away from this is that nuclear weapons, basic nuclear weapons, simple nuclear weapons are the result of 1940s technology, analog technologies developed without computers, putting pen to paper, as our strategic bombers, World War II strategic bombers, as our, Werner von Braun's missiles. And I think that we need to keep it in mind when we talk about a technology like that. It doesn't necessarily has to be the most complicated. We're not talking about AI. So, for example, when Olmert and Bush, and this came out in the books and the biographies, detailing the 2007 discussions leading to the decision to bomb the reactor. One of the things Olmert tells Bush is, listen, it's Syria. They don't need a missile. They can just plonk a nuclear device on a bomber and just crash it in Israel. And I'm adding, yes, because we're talking about 1940s technology. Nuclear weapons do not have to be deployed in the most complicated ICBM run with AI capabilities, right?
Alan Weiner.
Thanks very much for a super interesting project. I have one question and two small comments. The question is, other WMD, whether Israel's, according to foreign sources, some of Israel's neighbors, Egypt and Syria, were reported to have very active CW programs. Of course, we saw Syria's CW deployed later, and I'm wondering whether we see the same pattern of counter-proliferation with the CW program, or whether Israel just didn't see that as the same kind of threat. Two small comments. One, it might be interesting to add, because I'm an international lawyer, to your project something about the difference between a political commitment, as opposed to a legally binding instrument. If you want to talk about that, I can help. And the other thing I would just say is, in your book, I would not include a picture of Tarnoff, because I'm almost certain that he did not write that memo. He was just the executive secretary who signed it. He signed it out, right? But he's like that's his job, is to communicate to the other executive branch agencies. And it would probably be worth figuring out who
would have written it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether that would have been NEA or whether that would have been like the Non-Proliferation Bureau. I mean, I don't know, but I mean, it's an administrative function for Tarnoff to actually send that off to the NSC.
These are great comments. It didn't occur to me that if someone signed the memo, he may not have authored it, and it should cause a reconsideration of how we assign responsibility for memos, because it's basically what I work. It's a key method in how we assign responsibility. As to the political commitment comment, I think you're spot on, and I encourage you to read Adam Entus's 2018 story about the Israel-US understanding from the New Yorker magazine. And I may have prepared a quote here. Let's see if I have it. Yes, so and Entus went and he actually interviewed former US officials anonymously, but they spoke on the record, and he asked them, well, how do you view the understanding in the letter? And they told him, well, it fell short of constituting a binding commitment, and the Americans were less categorical and not explicit. Everything here is a quote from the story. or in the words of one official, it wasn't a blanket statement, we'll never ask Israel to give up its nuclear weapons. It was more, we accepted that Israeli argument that they're not going to disarm under current conditions. So it's absolutely not a binding legal instrument by any means, which is what makes it informal, which actually makes that characterization just wrong. The fact that some Israelis think that it's a formal seal of approval is actually a mischaracterization of a political commitment.
And one of the tricky issues with political commitments is the question of whether they transcend the particular administration to make them, right? So Eisenhower gave commitments to the security of Saudi Arabia back in the 1950s, and those aren't renewed. Everybody understands that that commitment is good and is a commitment of the United States, not of the Eisenhower administration. With other political commitments, it's fuzzier about whether it's a commitment by that administration or it is a commitment, albeit non-binding, of the United States government.
Which underlines the vulnerability of this understanding, because if you decide that every president has to go through a ritual where they meet the prime minister, hand them a letter, and then brief the press, and the first instance where a president will not do that would actually underline the vulnerability or the break of the norm. So thank you, Alan, for that. And just on the CW, it's something that we don't have enough information about, because so I can't answer it for a lack of knowledge, basically. But I've never seen anything in Israeli files that would lead me to conclude that they were worried of chemical weapons as they're worried of nuclear proliferation. It's the opposite.
We have a question here from Kunal Singh, who is a
Fingers from David.
Oh, two finger from David.
Oh, ah.
Okay, I'll put you on after this. Kunal Singh, MIT PhD candidate, asks, what's the difference in the, how do you explain the difference in the US reaction to the Osiriq raid and the Al-Kabara raid? Does it have to do with the fact that the US was blindsided by the first, but knew about the second? In the Syrian case, the US did not technically give its consent, but it sort of did. How do you explain those differences?
So first of all, thank you, Kunal, for the question. My explanation would span the entire book, and I will try to put it in a nutshell. I don't think it has to do with one component. I think we have an explanation here with many components in it. First of all, we have we can look at the bad relationship between Begin and Carter, which led to suspicion on Begin's part when Reagan came in, even though Reagan was super friendly, but Begin had already been kind of scarred, if you will. And then we have a very friendly, open relationship between Bush and Olmert. They're really best of buddies, and you can see it in the picture. This has to do with the fact that when Reagan was sworn in, Begin decided to keep the cards to himself, as opposed to Olmert, who basically briefed Bush. In Begin's instance, we have what we call a strategic misunderstanding, and I have a paper on this with my friend and colleague, Giordana Pulcini, where we basically show that Begin actually had a private discussion with Al Haig on 6 April 81 when Haig visits Israel, and Begin asks him, so what are you going to do with the French and Italian exports to the Iraqi program? And Haig tells him something like, I'm paraphrasing, he says, we ran out of diplomatic options. Haig doesn't even report this back. He doesn't consider this an important discussion. From what we think that Begin basically heard, well, go ahead with your plans. And there's a more complicated story behind it, but I would definitely put some stock into that. And the relationship itself in 1981 and 2007 is different. The Israel-US larger relationship. So I wouldn't separate it. I think we have contributing components which lead to this very dramatic difference, which I agree with the characterization.
It's great to have MIT PhD students online.
Thank you, Kunal.
Too. David, last question.
I just wanted to ask about the recent statement, I believe by a government minister, saying, why not use the bomb on Gaza? Now, is that just something that brushed aside? I think he was fired, right, from his position.
You'd hope, right? Okay, so thank you, David. So David is referring here to a comment by a minister called Amichai Eliyahu, who's the minister for heritage in the Israeli government. He's a minister that comes from the most radical faction, right-wing faction in the Israeli government. It's a political party called the Tzionut Datit. The specific name I don't think is as important. The political context, I think, is important. And the political context is that Netanyahu decided to legitimize this group as a politically legitimate party going into the last election cycle, and has made sure that they would be in office and be ministers, even though these are people that should not be in office and do not merit ministerial positions. Some of them, for example, Itamar Ben-Gvir, were actually convicted of assisting Israeli Jewish terror organization. He has 7 or 8 convictions, and Amichai Eliyahu is just one of this really illegitimate group of politicians who are in office. And when the war broke out, the first thing Netanyahu did, and Netanyahu, in my opinion, and I'll say it, is an illegitimate prime minister and should not be a prime minister. The first thing he did was to make sure that this radical faction stays in government. And he rebuffed all calls by other parties who wanted, specifically one party that wanted to go in and form a unity government. They asked him to expel them, and he refused because he's in the midst of a deep political maneuver trying to ascertain his political survivor during the war and after the war. And this is why when Minister Amichai Eliyahu shouldn't have been in office, in my opinion, in the first place, when he said that one option is to drop an atom bomb on Gaza, he was actually not fired. And this is an example of what we call in Latin kakistocracy, the fact that the least worthy people are in office. Specifically, Amichai Eliyahu's comment was brushed away. Amichai Eliyahu has no idea of what's going on in Israel's nuclear program. Amichai Eliyahu is a religious figure who, again, heads the Israel Heritage Ministry. And the fact that he deigned to say what he said also just underlines how irresponsible he is, and the fact that he should not be an Israeli minister. So I think that, and I hope to see him out of office soon, as I do hope towards Netanyahu.
Let me just, before we thank you, just say that we should be thanking you, not for just the talk, but for being here. It's been great.
Thank you.